Yamadumurang, Nadu Yinjamara Gadigal Main, Eora Main, Nadu Yinjamara Gadigal Nurumba. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we are meeting. Tonight, the Federal Treasurer thinks we need a more compassionate capitalism, but what does that mean? If you're young, does that mean getting a house? If you're a refugee, does that mean getting a visa? And what if you're an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person? What does it mean for you? Well, joining our panel, award-winning author and refugee advocate Behrouz Boochani, who is back in Australia for the first time since spending 6 years on Manus Island. New South Wales Liberal Party Vice President, Jacqui Munro. National Voice of Our Children, Chief Executive Liddle. Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Tehan. And Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones. Welcome them all.
Well, with the current rental crisis leading to skyrocketing rental prices across the country and many unable to find accommodation at all, how do you propose we support young people and those doing full-time study to find affordable accommodation?
Stephen.
We've got a housing crisis in the country and it stems from the fact that we don't have enough houses. So our policy, and we'll be legislating our $10 billion housing fund in the Parliament this week, our policy is all directed at building more houses at every end of the market, but particularly social and affordable housing, so that young people such as yourself, I assume, are attending university or aspiring to, can find a rental property near or in the same area where you're going to university. When you finish university, you get a job, you're able to afford to buy a house in the area where you're working. And that right throughout the area of the housing market, we have more houses available at every area within the market. It's going to take a while. We've just got to be honest with people.
Is that going to make rental more affordable, though? Because the houses you're talking about are houses for people to purchase as well. You're talking about an extra houses, but you're looking at, what, 10,000 homes? It won't start until mid next year. What does that do right now for people who are struggling to pay rent?
You're right, Stan. The reality is this should have been started a decade ago. It wasn't. Whenever we start, it's going to take time. We are still living in the shadow of the COVID economy, where supply chains have been fractured. We've got skill supply shortages. We've got building supply shortages. So even if we wanted to turn it on and say, let's build 10,000 houses within the next 6 months, that's a promise that we couldn't deliver.
And you also can't promise to keep rent down, can you?
Well, no, we can't promise to keep rent down, but what we know is unless we do the things that are contained within our housing policy, the problems you describe are going to get worse. So at the very minimum is ensuring the situation doesn't get worse, and working with the state and territory governments, which is why we've formed a housing accord, and is why we know that we've got to get every link in the chain sorted out, whether it's planning decisions and ensuring we're bringing new developments onto the market, ensuring that we get new supply onto the market, and ensuring that from the federal government, the levers that we have, which are funding levers, they're all working in unison. But, you know, I'm not going to say to you or anyone else we can turn this around overnight, but whenever we start, it's going to take a while.
Josh, your situation, you're studying at the moment. I believe you're living at home, right?
Yeah, so I feel myself, I'm lucky, you know, to be from a family living near where I am on placement as a fifth-year medicine student.
But could you move out? Could you afford to move out?
I think balancing university commitments and, work, supporting yourself, it does become very challenging. We're seeing amongst our peers at the moment having to offer $100+ over what's requested for their weekly rent to be able to secure a property. I think this is particularly true for students from regional, remote areas, rural areas, Indigenous communities, as well as those from interstate and international students from overseas. So I guess any suggestions to help resolve those issues for those communities.
And you raised questions about the most vulnerable and Indigenous communities. What's the situation for Indigenous families trying to rent, Catherine?
Oh, I tell you what.
Let alone get a mortgage.
I'll tell you what, it's a funny conversation to be having in Australia, because in regional and remote areas, particularly in Indigenous communities, we've been in housing crisis for decades. We've been screaming about this for decades, and when our children come into universities, many of them have to come interstate, and they're coming from families that absolutely have no capacity to offer additional support while you're there. We know that things like ab-study don't cover the rent. They really don't, not in this environment. And we know they barely pay for your food, and yet the way the red tape exists around things like ab-study and Oz-study means it is very, very difficult to work simultaneously because it's an uncertain market. You don't know what your shifts are going to be. You're not in full-time employment. You're constantly answering to what you might think you might earn, and tell you what, if you get it wrong, you're going to get smashed by Centrelink. It is an awful time to be trying to find appropriate accommodation for anyone who's in a vulnerable situation. For our families in the bush, it's a nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare. And when we look at things like the rising price of energy, the rising costs, the escalation of prices in remote and regional areas is ridiculous. Those communities have been paying $5 a litre for fuel for a very long time, $40 for a pumpkin.
$5 a litre?
Absolutely. I saw a photo once of a pumpkin for $40 while those communities are sitting there living off Centrelink. And they're living off Centrelink because we never put the investment into community development, economic development. The jobs aren't there. So you have all those stresses. But it's interesting, if I go back to the original question, one of the things that I've heard recently is actually for mainstream Australia, it's not a housing shortage, it's a bedroom shortage, and that's because we haven't looked at things like negative gearing, where we have very, very wealthy people that might own, 20 plus properties with multiple bedrooms, and they're not selling it because we've made it too expensive to sell, right? So we know that housing costs, the prices might be dropping. You might lose $200,000 on a house, but the cost of sale offsets that, so people don't want to give it up. So there potentially is something to be looking at in that space as well.
Well, and we know that's Stephen. When it comes to negative gearing, that's the third rail, right? You don't want to touch taxation and negative gearing. We know that's been the case. We won't go back and revisit the 2019 election when you went down that road. But Behrouz, what about for refugees as well? The situation that refugees face, particularly people, and we're going to come to this issue a bit later, but particularly people on temporary protection visas in trying to secure some form of consistent and affordable housing?
Yeah, I think we will get back to refugees. We will talk about refugees, but actually, to be honest, since I've been here in Australia, I've been here, I came here last month, and I've been in shock to see homeless people on the street in this country. And I understand Australia through my experience, while I was in Manus Island and I was looking at Australia. And I think you should be very angry, and I'm angry as well, instead of you, of these politicians, that they are talking about housing, but actually they've spent more than $14 billion in those islands. And that money went to the pocket of security companies. And now, I find it ridiculous that last week, this government made a contract with an American company with $420 million just to keep 70 people in Nauru. And those people are in Nauru for almost 10 years. So I think you should ask this question, how they waste this money, and they should be accountable. They should answer that how they use this money, Of course, we will get back to human rights abuse and what this government has done, both political parties, but I think they should answer that how they wasted this money. And that company...
I'll give Stephen Jones a quick reply to this, and then we are going to revisit this issue a bit more substantially later, but just a quick response to Behrouz.
Firstly, I want to acknowledge your own lived experience. We inherited contracts we've renewed them. We will ensure that there continues to be an offshore processing facility as a part of our border protection policies, but it's our objective to ensure that there's nobody there. There are over 140 people in Nauru. When we obtained government, there are less than 65 people there today.
Okay,
our objective is to get that to zero.
We are getting ahead of ourselves, but Behrouz is going to be in Canberra tomorrow talking specifically about this. Your objective is to get it to zero when?
Our objective is to get it to zero over the course of this year through the processes that we have been accelerating, mainly through ensuring that these people have third country settlements, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's the United States.
But they will come to Australia first, mainland, before they're given third country settlement?
Some of those details have to be worked out, but my understanding with the Immigration Minister, my understanding is directly a direct transfer to the third. So
they will not be coming to mainstream Australia. They will stay in offshore detection.
Yes,
until they go to a third.
Until they are.
Actually, here I'm not talking about human rights in this.
I know the point.
I will get back to human rights, and everyone know that what Australia has done, how Australia has created a tragedy. But now, for that particular question, I am asking about money. What are you going to do with $420 million in that island just to keep 70 people in that island? How you want to use that money?
Well, the objective actually...
just answer that.
I do. Thank you, and again, acknowledging your experience there, and we would rather you wouldn't
I'm not talking about my experience now. I'm talking
I don't want to be dismissing that.
I'm talking as
Let
a
me be very clear.
person.
Our objective is to have nobody there. Our objective is to have nobody there, but to continue to have a facility there as a deterrent and to be used as necessary. But our objective is to have nobody there, or if anybody is there, they're there for a very short period of time, until a third country settlement arrangement can be put in place.
I'm Jamie. I'm a Lurcha Pinibi man. I've been living and working in the Central Desert area for most of my life. I was lucky enough to be living on a community for a long time and learnt how to heal people the Aboriginal way, which is the only way out here is through Aboriginal way. We've heard loud and clear from the Central Australian families, communities, tribal groups, language groups, that they want their kids back on country, they want their kids to learn culture, they want their kids learning their language, they want their kids happy and well and safe. Youth programs have been underfunded, they've had funding capped for 8 years, but yet we have this expectation that we're going to get permanent solutions out of these short-term funding models which don't work. My question is, why is government in charge of these why is government in charge of this decision-making when they have no expertise in the area?
Catherine.
Yeah, I actually had the pleasure of going and watching one of the programs Jamie worked in once, and it was
this is your country, of course.
Yeah, this is my country, and certainly out that way, my nana's mother's country. And this was a Jillera program, so Jillera, the men's tools, and it was the most wonderful thing to watch, the calmness. So those of you who would have heard Stan's Welcome to Country and Language, that is the language that belongs to this country, and the country listens. And I'm sure as you heard those words, a sense of calmness you would not have anticipated hearing you would have felt it. When you're watching men, those old men working with those young men on country, and watching them as they make those tools in the rhythm of the country, tools that they've gone and looked for. While they're looking for it, they're talking about what's going on in their lives. They're learning their ancient stories. And be careful of that word ancient, because we are a modern society as well. But these are things we've known about healing for a very long time. And then they sit down with those old men, and those old men look at them and they smile at them and they tell them they're doing a really good job in the most gentle way. And all the time, the rhythm of those tools making people feel strong. So there is absolutely a need for more opportunity to do those things. Do those programs run out of money all the time? Are those policy settings unfair? Are they informed by Aboriginal people? And I think that absolutely connects to the essay, which talked about Are governments listening to people? It also talks to what Bruce was saying when he said accountability. We are looking at internationally at democracies saying governments need to be accountable. Aboriginal people are saying governments need to be accountable. The only people in Indigenous affairs that are ever held accountable for the outcomes that our families and children experience are us. That is why we see escalating numbers of our children in juvenile detention centres. And again, when we're looking at accountability in Australia, and this is not necessarily only for Indigenous children, it can cost up to $1 million per child to put you in a juvenile detention centre. What would it cost to give your family rent-free, a safe home, one where we could wrap you around and we could work on what might be going wrong in your life at this moment in time? So are the right voices in the room? No, they're not. Are we seeing a massive shift towards more local-based commissioning? Yes, we are. And again, that's a lot of the work that organisations like SNAICC does in negotiating for more local-led decision-making and local-led commissioning models. But those things take an incredible amount of goodwill and they require an incredible amount of transformation within local procurement processes.
And Dan Tehan, what we're talking about here and what Jamie has mentioned and what Catherine has talked about is a lack of support for the very programs that people are calling for now to deal with the crisis that we're seeing playing out in places like Alice Springs. And yet, remote youth programs have not had a funding increase since 2014, when you were in power. Why not? Why weren't you supporting those programs?
Very quickly, it was worse than that. We saw cuts of $500 million. A significant amount of that $500 million was child and family services, 80 million alone Aboriginal child care services that were developed to raise our children steeped in culture with the support systems that they need in order to ensure that our families were strong. And if you look at the emerging trends like Alice Springs, where does that put you? 10 years from children who were 0 to 5 right now. How old are they and who's on the streets?
So these are obviously very complex issues, and government.
I think it's very simple. Catherine just said right. you stripped money out and you've frozen money since 2014.
Well,
it's not complex.
I'm not. Well, they are very. Well, Stan, they are very complex issues, and there isn't any easy, simple solution. And
True.
I don't know the exact what happened with funding. Funding might have been moved from programs because governments ultimately in the end are accountable to what the outcomes on the ground are, and might have been moved to other programs. I don't know the exact details of what happened with funding, where it went, what happened. But these are very, very complex issues. And what we need to be doing, and Jamie's absolutely right, we do need to be focusing on the children, and we've got to be making sure that we're getting the best outcomes that we can for those children, and making sure that we've got local solutions which work and ultimately get the type of outcomes that we're looking for. And I'm sure all governments of all political persuasions want that for all children in this nation. And the key to it is to make sure that we are getting those outcomes, and we're making sure that these programs are delivering the results that we all want to see. There is no one here, and I'm sure there is no one in this room that doesn't want to see outcomes for children which mean that they're going to have better futures than we have. But the complex issue is, how do you achieve that? And governments have been trying to...
Would that mean that you would support the voice to Parliament if that brings more of the voices you're talking about into the room?
Well, one of the things, and this goes to the heart of this issue, and, what we were working on is ensuring that you do have local and regional voices. Now, all that seems to have been completely lost, and now what we're looking at is the focus is completely on a national voice. I come from a rural... It is. I come from a rural and regional area. I haven't heard mention of the local and the regional voices in the last 6 months of this discussion. I come from a rural and regional area. I want to make sure that the people in my electorate are going to be listened to, because what doesn't work is if you have a bureaucracy in Canberra, and this is what's led to the troubles that we're seeing right across the board. You have a bureaucracy in Canberra that is telling people what should happen and where it should happen, it doesn't work. And the sad reality about Labor governments in particular, the further you get away from capital cities, the more you are neglected. And that's why we need to get back to looking at how are the local and regional voices going to work.
But this is where the difference between the practical implementation of a voice and the principle of it being enshrined in the Constitution, I don't think is being discussed differently enough. I support the voice. I think it was fantastic, for example, that Dominic Perrottet, as our Liberal Premier, actually signed
but
the
Peter Dutton
in-principle.
won't say that he supports it, so
Well,
where does that leave the Liberal Party?
Not yet. And I think there are months to go of this discussion. I mean, it's fair to have a discussion. That's what politics is all about.
You've learned enough to support it. Dominic Perrottet's learned enough to support it. So what would you say to Dan Tehan about supporting it?
So my view is that it is a good thing for our nation to recognise and respect a group of people who have been custodians of this country for over 60,000 years, and to respect a part of their governance in our founding document. And in a way, I think nothing could be more liberal and even perhaps conservative, in that liberalism is about taking responsibility. It's about that individual drive for progress. And our Constitution, as our founding document of the modern Australian nation, the desire to be enshrined within that is fundamentally a conservative idea, in that you want to, or perhaps a liberal idea, that you want to strengthen the institutions that govern us well. And I think that the voice does that beautifully in recognising our first people in that founding document. So that's the principal argument. The next stage of the practical implementation, I mean, obviously the Calmer and Langton review does in fact talk about the local and regional voices in great detail. Yeah. And that's generally what we seem to be basing our discussion on.
Hi, I've got a slightly different question to Behrouz. Hi, Behrouz. In your past interviews, you have repeatedly criticised the mainstream media. In what you believe they have failed to portray a sound and fair reflection of the reality. You called it the dark side of democracy. Since you retrieved your freedom, you have been very well featured in many Western mainstream media, like here in ABC. What has changed your views, media, both or none? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that is a critical question, because for many years I've been, working as a journalist, and the language that I used was and is not following the current journalism language, because in my perspective, at least about refugees, that media are a part of or are serving this system, So for many years, even ABC, if we talk about ABC, for 1 decade, Australia has been doing, in my perspective, crime against humanity in those islands. But actually, this particular program, how many programs we had about refugees, that people come here and discuss it, right people. I know that we already had 1 program, but I think people who appeared in that program, most of them were wrong. They were not people who were working on the ground. So I think Australia should face this reality. Australia should really discuss this, People should really know the truth about what's happened in those islands and in detention in Australia. We are facing a detention industry, and this detention industry that I mentioned before, they've spent $14 billion in this, detention, and people of Australia, I think, have this right to know, and they should know, they should hear that from the mainstream media in this country. And that is your duty. We are living in a liberal democracy. We are living in a democracy. So I think people expect that people come here and tell the truth. That's what people expect.
Jacqui, I want to go to something that we have Behrouz here, and something that Peter Dutton said when he was Immigration Minister, that Behrouz would not be permitted to come to Australia. And he said, I'll be very clear about that. What do you say to Behrouz tonight when he's sitting here talking about the plight of refugees, when Peter Dutton didn't want him here?
Well, can I say that I'm very happy that New Zealand have accepted Behrouz as a permanent resident, because if you look at Australia's...
And we couldn't?
No. This is a really important point. If you look at Australia's record at taking refugees, it is far, far superior to that of New Zealand's. So, well, look at the record.
But I think the question was directly though. You're not speaking to Behrouz.
No, I should say something actually. I'm very glad that for the first time someone from Liberal Party mentioned my name. And there you go. And that always they call me an individual, Peter Dutton and others. Malcolm Turnbull in the election on 2016, he just pretended I don't know this guy. So I think that shows the mentality of this system and this government, because they don't want to recognize us as a human being. And that's why they design a system to dehumanize refugees. So I'm very glad that you mentioned my name.
You did mention that. Can I go back to Rihanna? You had a follow-up question as well about the situation in Iran.
Sorry, can you say that?
You have a follow-up question as well.
Yeah. I think another thing Behrouz would like to talk about is about IRGC, right?
That's the Iranian Republican Guard.
Yeah, stands for Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. I've got a challenging question for you, Behrouz. IRGC is an official military arm of Iran, which simply means, for the people who don't know context, that hand in hand with the military of Iran, IRGC has defended the integrity of my country, Iran, over decades. Now, in the current situation, don't you think that putting IRGC under the terrorist list, which even doesn't fit the Australia regulatory framework, would mean a preliminary action for another war in a region you and me have come from? Don't you think that you, as a human rights activist, can you be very clear saying that, are you an advocate of war, another war against your motherland country, Iran? Thank you.
I think your approach is very wrong, because you say that IRGC has been defending Iran, but actually IRGC had a big role at creating a huge tragedy in Syria. That's why I think, and also because IRGC, they have killed many people, especially over the past 4 months. 500 people, protesters on the street. That's why I strongly believe that IRGC should be in the terrorist list. That's what I believe.
Well, there you go, Stan. I bet you didn't expect that me and Behrouz would be actually agreeing on something like this. And I agree with you, Behrouz. You are absolutely spot on.
And Stephen Jones, is that likely to happen?
These are matters for the Foreign Minister to announce at the appropriate point in time. It's not my role to do that. Can I actually make this point though? I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that you're featured on programs like this, and I'm glad you're coming to Canberra tomorrow. It speaks well of a vibrant democracy, but also a confident government. We don't shut down people who don't agree with us. We say, come put your arguments. We might agree, we might disagree. I happen to disagree with some of the things that you've said about our record. I think it's pretty good, actually. And it will get better as we implement our policies. But I'm glad you're here.
Actually.
I'm actually glad you're here, and I'm glad you're advocating the points, and I'm glad you're telling your story. I think it's a good thing.
This is a really important point, though, because if you know a little bit about Behrouz's background and story, it was actually Kevin Rudd and a decision that he made in 2013 that meant that Behrouz didn't come to Australia. I think you missed out by 2 or 3 days when that decision was made, according to...
parties.
So I think we need to just check the...
It's not only about Liberal.
Rudd slams the door on boat people, and that was the decision that was taken based on the reading that I have of his background.
I'm not sure what the point.
We're almost out of time, but just finally, Behrouz, what would you like to achieve tomorrow when you're in Canberra?
Yeah, tomorrow I am going to actually support the legislation that Green Party put on the table to transfer those people who are in Port Moresby and Nauru to Australia. And there are 140 people, 70 in Port Moresby, 70 in Nauru. And I think Labor should support that because you supported the Medevac law, if you remember, in the former government. So if you don't support this, that means that you didn't believe, and that was just a political issue for you. So you should support this because you already supported Medevac law in the former government. So that's why what we expect, that Labor show some, be brave and trust in your power, trust in people who support you, and do something for refugees.
And we'll await that response. Rihanna, thank you so much for your questions. That's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel, Behrouz Boochani, Jacqui, Munro, Catherine Liddle, Dan Tehan and Stephen Jones. Please thank them.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your stories and questions. Next week we're live from Melbourne, and you can head to our website to register to be in the audience. Until then, have a good night.